right, here we go. 3, 2, 1.
Okay, we're all here, so let's go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody to this Friday Tech Talk. I'm really excited about this topic. Hopefully, for those of you that are here, you're very new to DBT. I put this together to just talk through the core features that convinced me that DBT was the right tool for a lot of my clients and why I've been using it. And so there's a lot to get into. So this is just the teaser for many other presentations and demonstrations to come. A little bit about me. If you haven't met me before or don't know me, I'm the Director of Data Engineering at Improving Minnesota. I've been a software engineer or above for 20 years or more, a little over that. Been working in distributed data systems for almost the last decade. I'm a retired adjunct instructor. And I say retired because I retired from teaching this year so that I can focus more on consulting. But about me, I love topics where we can do software engineering better, which tends to focus on testing and agile. But in other cases, it's designing your systems appropriately. So today, I've got 4 key areas that I'm going to cover. I'm going to do a quick introduction just to get you on the footing for what DBT is, what its purpose is. And we're going to get right into concepts with demonstrations, live code, running, and showing how things work. So I'm going to run ELT pipelines, which I'll cover what ELT is in a little bit. Then how to test these pipelines. So how can I actually verify the quality of the data coming out of my pipelines? And I'm going to go show some examples and also how easy it is to build tests. And then the last phase of this is going through documentation and lineage, one of the key missing points that I find on teams, where it's really difficult to understand what's in your data, what your data structures are, how they're related and things like that, but also how DBT handles lineage as a part of your operational running your code. So let's get started. Quick introduction. What is ELT? So DBT is an ELT tool. It is not an ETL tool. It's not a data ingestion tool. And what that means is data gets put onto a system. And so this might be your data lake, like my S3, Azure data lake. Maybe it's inside a SQL server. I'm going to be using SQL Server as my lake today. But the data gets put in there. And then once it's in there, then you move data within it. You perform transformations, you create new data artifacts, you do all of your data work within there. This is a very common process. And in fact, it's a process that I prefer most of the time because I can have all my data in one place from the start. So that's what ELT is. It's not the same as data engineering. Data engineering or analytics engineering is a sort of an extension of that. ELT is a part of the data engineering process, but it's the code part. When I look at data engineering, I really care about all the other facets, like how do you maintain your systems? How do you test your systems? How do I know what's happening within my system? How do I support it? Those are the types of things that when I get into the engineering side, that's where it goes beyond just writing code. Now, speaking of code, there's 2 concepts that I just want to explain because DBT is low code and it's high code versus low code. So one of the entrance barriers for many teams in getting into data engineering and doing it well, especially when it comes to the testing, documentation, quality, and all of those other things, is that they're high code systems and they're very complicated to start with. High code is when you're handwriting a lot of your pipelines. So things like building Spark pipelines, building Flink pipelines, building Java pipelines, Python pipelines, you're writing a lot of code. And anytime you need to do extra testing, anytime you need to do extra observability, those types of things, they're not really built in. You have to hand code them. Now, what's great about them is it makes it really easy to test because you have access to the underlying code. It's also really easy to customize for your exact needs. But the hard part is, how do I handle exceptions? How do I know what my throughput is? Those types of things are called data ops. You have to hand code those as a part of your software suite. That's where low code comes in. There's a lot of frameworks, whether they're GUI based or in this case, DBT. What they are is they're largely frameworks that handle a lot of those data ops types of pieces, like making it easier to test or document or to hook up components or to integrate with other external systems. They make a lot of that easier through configuration. The difficult part there is that testing is a little bit tougher. So this is one where you have to this trade-off of how do I do the testing, and you have to think a little harder about it. But usually they provide some means for you to be able to do some testing. But these low-code systems are really good for teams that are growing, teams that are new to data engineering, teams that are new to data in ETL, maybe just learning new tools. All right, so that's kind of the background. So what is DBT? DBT, Data Build Tool, is a low-code ELT solution. What you do is you define models, which are the structures of your tables, the structures of your views, the structures of things within your database, using these templates. And then you define the SQL that populates those models. So very low code. But what DBT allows you to do then is now reference models within your pipeline, and it hooks them up for you. It creates the actual the graph of how things are supposed to run. It creates which tests are supposed to run. If something fails, what not to run. So if one step fails, don't run the following steps, things like that. So DBT takes care of all that other management for you. And that's a really powerful tool. So here's a quick example of a model configuration. It's just YAML. And so we're not going to get into the details of what this is, but this is a model. I have the name of the model. So I've got a table called ontime denorm, which you'll see. I've got some metadata. I'm labeling which columns are in there. We'll get into tests. Which tests do I run when I run my DBT tests? Things like that. So what will happen is DBT will compile this into the documentation, and it'll reference these when it's doing its pipeline runs. Then the other part of a definition is the model itself, which here on the left, I have some configuration parameters like, okay, am I creating a table? Or am I creating a view? Or what am I creating here? What's the database I'm using? And I can actually label things with tags, and I'm going to use those in this demonstration. I'm going to use tags. But all it is, okay, what's the SQL that runs? What's really cool about this is I can reference things. I have other models in my data that I'm going to show you. I can now reference those as a part of the code. And I'll show an example of that. So that's low code. I'm not writing any code. I can run this pipeline. Once I create these things, I'm going to run it, and DBT takes care of all the rest, which is really fantastic. One of the things from the low code system that it needs is other configurations. So here's my connection profiles. You need a global profile.yaml file as a part of your project. So in here, I've created one. I've got configurations for SQL Server and one for Postgres. I've named them SQL Server and Postgres, so I guess that's a little confusing, but I could have named this SS and PG. Then I have things like targets. So I could have multiple targets within my database system. So I have local SS raw. This is me saying it's my local version of SQL Server. It's the raw database. I could have another one for the model database, and it would have a different configuration. But again, this is just configuration files. What's the adapter that DBT needs to use it? So you install the adapters are used, and then the rest of the configuration. Now I can reference these connections as I'm running my pipelines, and I can port these. So I can have a local one, I can have one for my dev environment, I can have a profile for my test environment. So I can have all these different profiles and targets for my various environments. All right, one more configuration I just want to show is the project configuration. So the profile information is your global connection information. It's how DBT will run. Then you have your project. So I'm building a pipeline, which is a project. I've got a name of the project, which profile I'm using. So I'm using the SQL Server profile from that last screen that I showed. I can also configure the layout of my project, the folders where things exist. In this case, I'm saying there are models in the models folder, and there's some references in the sources folder. So DBT knows where to go to find them, and it'll look for them, and then it'll compile it into its pipeline and its metabase and metadata about the pipeline. And then we have the model configuration. So these are global things about my models within my project. So in here, I'm saying for the DBT demo project, the default materialization is a view, not a table. And I'm saying, so by default, if I don't create this as part of one of the parameters or the configurations for a model, it'll create a view by default and not a table. And of course, there's other things in here. So here I've got some configuration for seeds, which I'm going to show you in a second. So those things that I've showed you so far, the SQL plus these configurations, these are how you build pipelines. The coding is very minimal. Okay, so from there, I'm going to move now on to how do I actually create and run pipelines. So I'm going to run one. I'm going to start with this example that I like to use in my class. It's using airport data. And what this one does is I'm going to start with these airport codes. These are lookup values for airports. So they've got a code and a description. I've got carrier codes, which are the airline carrier. It's the code and a description. These CSVs, I'm going to load those into the database using DBT, which is only for static data, lookup type data. You shouldn't use it for live data, frequently changing data. Then once I have these lookup tables built in the raw database, I'm then going to perform some ELT. I'm going to parse, and this one I want to parse the city name out of the description. I want to parse the airport name out of the description. I'm going to store those in a new table called airport data. It's a more conformed table that I can use for lookups. I'm going to do the same with carrier data. I'm going to it's got some descriptions. In fact, let's take a look at what those look like. As long as we're here, I actually haven't seeded the data yet, so I can't look at it. But you'll see this. I'll show you this in a second. But the description has when that carrier's name was valid from in a 2 years. So I'm going to parse those out, and I'm going to create a table called carrier data, and then I'm going to plop a view over the top of that fills any null years for the end year with 9999. Now, once I have all my lookup data, then it's going to perform my full ELT process. It's going to take data from this ontime data, which I've already seeded. So I've already got this data in my database. So I've done the ELT, I've done the load as a part of this, and I can show you that. So if I look at in here, you can see my table. So I've got on-time data. If I select this, the top 1,000 rows, I've got just raw flight data that I'll be using. So I'm going to look that up, and I'm going to join it to the airport code and carrier codes based on the codes within that raw data, and create what's called the denormalized table. And that'll be on-time denorm. So let's start with seeding the data. Seeding the data is when you have lookup data that doesn't change very often, and you want to push it into some tables. Very easy to configure. So how do I configure this? Over here on the left, let's see if I can't really make the left side bigger, but well, you can see I have a data folder. This is part of my project's configuration. In my project's configuration, I said, where are my seed paths? It's in the data folder. So if I go in here, you'll see airport codes.csv, carrier codes.csv. And then I have a configuration file that says, okay, for airport codes, it'll look for the airport codes.csv. Here's some metadata about it. Here are the columns that are in there. Are they quoted within the CSV? So this is, again, the configuration. I don't have to write the code for, a lot of times, if I'm doing Python, I'm going to open the file, then I'm going to parse the CSV, then I'm going to add it to a data frame, and then I'm going to put it into SQL. That's a lot of code. And here, I just say, hey, here's what they look like. So I'm going to run this. Let's do a clear. All right, so I want to seed this first. So I'm doing, whoops. So you can see that it says DBT password is cat. So this is the command I want to run, is DBT seed. This is seeding the data. But if in my project configuration, what I want to show you is inside my profile, I didn't want to store my password in Git. And so what I said was I configured this and said, hey, look up the environment variable called DBT password. So now every time I run my code, instead of having to type in the password and pass it on the command line, I have it read from a file called complicated, and it opens that file, sets the environment variable for DBT password as a part of this run, and fills that in. So you can kind of ignore that. It's just setting that environment variable that I configured as a part of my setup. So if I run DBT seed, remember, all I created was a YAML file and put the CSV files. It does all the rest. So it found the airport codes file, found the carrier codes file, and now I can go see how easy that was. I'm going to refresh this. Now I have airport codes and carrier codes. So in my carrier codes, you can see here, I mentioned here's the code in the description. I'm gonna parse out the name here, and then the from and the 2 year. I need to pull those out so that I can actually use those as part of my ELT pipeline. I've also got the airport codes, which, whoops, it's on time data. I want airport codes. Okay, so in here, I've got in the description, I've got the city and the state where the airport is, the name of the airport. So as a part of my ELT, I'm going to have code that parses these out and puts them into another table in the model database. Okay, so now that we've got those seeded, I don't need this code. Let's go back to the presentation. Okay, so I've got seeded data. So now I want to run my entire pipeline. So let's look at the configurations for these. The first one is for the airport data. So if I look in here on the left, I have in my models, I have airport data.sql. Oh, sorry, let's start with the configuration first. Okay, airport data.sql. I have some columns that I define. I'm saying I want the airport code, the description, so the raw description, but the parsed city and the name of the airport. I'm defining that, and then how does that look? How do I what's the code that I write so that DBT knows what to run? That's an airport data.sql. So in here, I'm saying tag this is lookup data, so give it a tag. And here's the actual SQL. It'll select from airport codes. So I've got a reference to airport codes. I can actually reference this, and this is going to generate the lineage in the end, which I'll show you at the end of this presentation. So I'm referencing airport codes. And so the first thing that I'm doing is I'm selecting from that. I'm ignoring anything with ZZZZ. I'm trimming out the description to get the city and the name, and I'm putting it into airport data. Okay, the next one was carrier data. Same concept. I've got a configuration in here for the carrier data table. I'm not going to go in depth into that one. I've got a carrier data.sql. This one I'm parsing out the year. I'm putting in the start year and the end year, but the end year could be null. That's okay. I'm leaving it that way for now, because the next step of this pipeline is create a view, and anything with a null year in it, just put 9999. And that's what this view is here. So you can see here, it's selecting from that carrier data table that I had the model for. Again, I don't have to put carrier data. I create a reference. What's important here is now this reference is really great, because now I can actually define the database and the schema. I can change those through configuration, and it'll automatically change within DBT. So there's my view. One more step to this pipeline is the ontime denorm table. So we'll take a quick look at that. And this is a little longer. It's selecting from those tables. It's joining, again, using a reference. It's not hard coding the table. It's referring to an object that's within DBT's model. I'm joining to the carrier data. I'm joining twice to the airport data, because I have an origin airport and a destination airport. So I'm joining to those and pulling data. So this is your typical ELT transformation. Now, my configuration, I didn't tell it to run these in order. What DBT will now do is it'll figure out, oh, this table references this other tables. So I need to create this view first. And in order to create this view, I need this carrier data table. And I also need the airport data before I do the denorm table. So DBT figures out all of that. So if you actually code this model using this DAG representation, you don't have to hook all those things up, which is what we've often had to do. So let's go ahead and run this thing. It's as simple as DBT run. Now I can put in here a target. I can choose the target database that I want to use on, but I've only got one in the SQL Server profile, so I've set the default to be my local raw. Okay, so all of those dependencies, if you look at this, it ran airport data first, then it ran carrier data, then it ran carrier data view, and now it's running the ontime denorm table. It's doing it in order because you can't run ontime denorm before you have the lookup data. So I've just created an entire pipeline by creating a handful of configuration files. There's some really cool things that happen underneath that we're going to cover in the end of those references, but let's take a look at the data now. So if I go back to my model database, which had no tables in it, and I refresh this, you can now see I've got the airport data. I've got the ontime denorm data. Let's look at the first few rows in the ontime denorm. You can see that the carrier description's in here. I also have something else that's new, the destination airport name. That came from airport data. Took care of all of that for me. I calculated whether or not the flight arrived. I put a calculation in there. So all of these things are in my data right now. So that's great. I have a pipeline that runs, but how do I know that it's correct? So those are some of the other things we'll get to in a little bit. All right, so there's my pipeline. Now, what happens if once a day, let's say once a day, or maybe once a month, I get new airport data or carrier data. I want to reload the lookup data, but I don't want to rebuild this denormalization table. Well, that's what tags are for. So this allows me to say, I'm only going to run things that are tagged with lookup, and it'll recreate those, but not recreate the underlying pieces, which may or may not be good. But let's see what that looks like. So you can see up here, DBT run -- model tag lookup. It's that easy. And I don't know if you've ever tried to run portions of a pipeline before, but actually writing the code for that to work is actually quite difficult. This is as easy as it is because DBT knows. Oh, what did I do wrong? Forgot a dash. Should have copy and pasted. DBT knows what the dependencies are, and it knows those tags. It compiles all that into its repository. So you can see here, it only ran airport data, carrier data, and the carrier data view. Just fantastic. All right, so that's using a tag to run. So we're able to run pipelines, and we'll run a couple more pipelines later because I'm going to show you some really neat other features. But what about testing these pipelines? This is where stuff gets really challenging. Now, I gave a talk not too long ago, a couple months ago, on using DBT for test-driven data engineering. And that was really difficult. There are probably, now I've learned there are better ways for me to do those tests, but I'm going to talk about data quality tests and pipeline tests that you can run. So let's take a look at the tests. I'm going to pull up a test. Well, before we get there, let's just talk about, besides testing, what are the other parts of the process that you need to consider? Okay, so how does your development process work? So part of the reason for testing is making sure that when you're doing development, that you have a good process to make sure that you don't inject defects, but also making sure that your pipeline continues to run. Okay, so you need things like Git and continuous integration. As a part of the testing, are you doing unit and functional testing or data quality testing? I'm going to show you data quality testing as a part of, or it's kind of a cross between functional and data quality testing as a part of this process. But that's what I'm going to show. And then you also have to worry about documentation. So when it comes to building data warehouses, what are the data dictionaries? People like to be able to search for fields and look for the meanings and figure out what they're dependent on. And it's important to have that documentation, but it's really difficult to build. And to be honest, the majority of the tools that I've used, yeah, they're really, really good and they're robust, but man, they can be really difficult to onboard at first and become a part of your process. With DBT, it's really built in. If you want to use the default, it's really robust. But then the next part is, how do I track lineage? Okay, I've had many clients where we say, what happens if I change this field on this table? Nobody knows how to find out downstream what happened or what to fix. And so that lineage is super important. We're going to do a deep dive into that. And then there's the continuous ELT process, which is, okay, great, I can load a table, but what if I need to rebuild them through using my tags or my lineage? Or what if I need to do incremental loads? Now, I'm not going to cover incremental loads today. That's a whole other topic. I just won't have time to get to it today. All right, so let's look at the development process before we get to testing, because testing is a part of this. So your analytical engineer, your analytics engineer, data engineer, whoever that might be, they're going to just help stand up the environment. You're going to perform your development and your testing like I've showed you in those configuration files and the SQL files. You're going to perform that locally. You're going to commit that to your source control. So I use Git. Use Git for most, for a lot of things, but whatever your source control is. Now, this is where your continuous integration and continuous delivery can work its magic. You can have the actual staging or testing bot that can pick up the new pipeline, run your tests, run your data, run your pipelines, make sure everything's good. And if that's good, merge it into the main branch. Now, this can be manual, it can be a bot. Then once it's in your main branch, because this is all happening through the command line, as you've seen so far, I'm running all of these through command line. Your Jenkins, whether you're using Jenkins or Drone or whatever, you'll be able to do a lot of these things just because you can run them through the command line. And I'm not going to get into DBT Cloud today, but there's other functionality there that's useful. But this allows me to then schedule these jobs to run. So Airflow is a really popular tool to use with DBT to run these pipelines in production. So let's say I have a daily tag. I have certain things that I want to run daily. I can have those as a tag, just like I ran the lookups tag earlier. I can say only run the models that are tagged as daily, and it'll run what's necessary. What about these data quality rules then? So what are my rules on ontime denorm? Well, here's what's cool about the configuration. I'm going to go back to the model for ontime denorm. And I'm just going to show you one of the tests. So DBT comes with tests in it already. And these tests that it comes with, there's accepted values, not null. I think there's a data integrity reference one. I can't remember what all the default tests are, but I'm saying this column can never be null. I don't even have to do any coding for this. So when I run my tests of my pipeline, I don't have to do anything. It'll just do the null checks for me. I've also got this accepted values. I'm saying I know that my data that I have right now is from 2016. So I'm saying the only valid values in the year column are 2016. So if there's anything that's not 2016, this pipeline needs to fail and throw the errors. This is how I define my test. This was it. I haven't handwritten any test. Now I do have a handwritten test that I'll show you later, but this is the default tests that come with DBT. Now there's two packages that are really important. DBT Utils that has a bunch more tests that are really useful that I use as a part of my DBT test-driven data engineering, and DBT Expectations, which mimics the Great Expectations toolkit for testing. Well, how do I run these tests? I'm going to only run the tests on the model ontime denorm. I'm just using it. I'm not going to run all my tests because there's quite a few of them. So I'm just going to run the tests on that particular model. And as you can see, I'm just running DBT test -- model ontime denorm. This configuration over here is producing all of this code that's running. It's verifying that that all of these, so this one, it verified that there are no nulls in that column. It validated that the only valid values were 2016. And that's really, really useful because now when I run my pipeline in an automated fashion, I can run the DBT test to make sure that after my pipeline is done and my tables are generated, I can run DBT tests. I can make sure that I didn't have any garbage data that was created. Now, what happens? Let's look at this one, for example. What this one is saying is if you have, it accepts the values of 2016. That's great. But what happens if I change and I say one or two or a handful of them were not 2016? So I'm going to run this code here. I'm going to update a few rows and I'm going to make it so that their year is 2017. And you can see here that affected 10 rows. So now I have 10 rows that are using the 2017 as their year. So I can go ahead and run. So let's say that's what happened when I ran my DBT pipeline. So let's run this test again. It's not changing any data. It's just running the test against the data that's there. And you can see that test now failed. And I'll show you to find out what the code of that test is, because I go and I dig in and I find out what the code failure was, so I can, if I need to dig into the code itself and figure out what query was run. But now I have a failure. But what if in your case, you're like, the accepted values is great, but I'm okay if if I have a threshold of 10. If there's 10 or more, I want it to fail. Great. So what I can do is I can actually override everything, almost everything that's a macro in DBT, I can override it. So I've got this accepted values test. I'm going to rename it to .SQL because I didn't have a SQL name on it so that it was hidden from DBT. But now I have it. And what I've done is I've overridden the accepted values test. So now it'll use this version of the test. So I can add a threshold parameter, and I've set it up so that it takes a new parameter called threshold. So I'm going to go ahead and add that parameter right here. I'm not going to write any code. I'm just writing configuration. I'm going to say the threshold for failure is 10. So if it's 10 or more, then it should fail. And we know that there are 10 that have 2017. Okay, so I'm going to run this test. Should still fail because I have 10, but if you look at it, it passed. Okay, so this is a little bit how I look at the test-driven data engineering. It's like, okay, I must have wrote a bad test. I'm going to go back in there and you can see I did, oh, if it's greater than 10. I want to say fail if it's greater than or equal to 10. So I'm kind of proving that this override it's using my functionality right now. So now if it's greater than or equal to 10 that don't match the year 2016, now it should fail. We look at that, we go, oh, great. Okay, so it failed. Now I might know my test works, I'm good to go. And so in this case, this is what would happen if somehow some sneaky 2017 data got in here. But I've made it so that the threshold, I can say, okay, that's fine if some other data gets in there, but let's say you're checking nulls. I wanted to extend it so that I only want to do I only want to throw an error if there's a certain percentage or a certain number of records that are in violation. But this is exactly how easy it was for me to add tests. All I had to do was write a little bit of SQL, and then I could use the test readily. And it overrode a default test that's built into DBT. This is pretty valuable stuff because now I have the ability to use their built-in tests from other libraries, and to write my own tests. And I like writing my own tests because that allows me to get to the point where I can do test-driven data engineering. All right, so curious, I got to see a question up here. So curious, why don't you control nulls with the column config? Also, does DBT actually create the table schema or run a create table SQL script in the project? Good questions. So I'm going to answer the create table one through code, but the short answer is it is running a create table statement because I'm doing what's called a kill and fill. I'm blowing away the table and reloading it. Now you can do it with incrementals where it doesn't do that, but we can look at the code that's happening under the covers. But the SQL Server DBT adapter is what's controlling that functionality. So control nulls with the column config. I'm curious. I'm not sure what the purpose of that question is. If whoever wrote that could clarify, that'd be great. Not sure what that means. Oh, by controlling nulls, you mean, I think you mean filling the default, putting a default value in the nulls. I probably wouldn't put it in the column config. I would probably put it in the SQL model as a part of the select statement. So I could have done it that way. I didn't do it that way in this case because I wanted to demonstrate some other functionality. So if I didn't answer your question, feel free to clarify, and we can tackle that a little bit later. Okay, I think we're doing pretty good on time. Yeah, actually, we're doing really good on time. So that's the testing functionality. So let's cover documentation. Now, this is one where I see so many teams get burned. And maybe you're really good about creating documentation up front, but it's hard to maintain documentation, whether you're using Confluence or you're using SharePoint, whatever you're using. In the end, you have to manually update all this stuff. And usually that's happening from a separate system. And sorry, I was just reading the question and the clarification. I'll come back to that in a second. So usually you're creating your documentation in a separate system, or maybe you're feeding it to Calibra or something like that. Well, what I like about DBT is they've looked at this problem and they've said, let's make this easy. Let's make it a part of the config so that while you're building the models, you can define those things now and then you're done with it. So let's take a look at a couple of the really cool features that are there. Sorry, I'm jumping around there. I meant to go to the next slide. So what are the types of documentation? Data dictionaries. Okay, so what columns, the descriptions, what in this case, they'll actually give you what tests are there. I did not define the data types, but data types would be in here. And I'll walk through these and some more stuff in there in a second. And then you have compiled SQL. If I want to know the exact SQL that was used to generate a table, so that that was used to populate the table, here's the select statement. In my case, it was a create table as select, but here's the SQL in the select that it used. So this is where it popped in the table and the database names from my config file. So I never put this stuff in there, if you recall, these were all using references within DBT. So it allowed DBT to compile this and figure out what the tables and database names were supposed to be. And then the last piece of the documentation is a lineage graph. Now, lineage graphs are really important. So you can see here, this lineage graph looks very similar to mine in the sense that it's saying, okay, I start with carrier codes and airport codes. Those are my root nodes. Then I create carrier data, airport data, the carrier data view. And then I also have this green is called a source. I've created a reference to this data, and those feed into ontime denorm. And then we'll get to this other view in a little bit. But you can see this lineage graph. Now I can actually see the dependencies. Now it's great to be able to see dependencies, but this is a small graph. What happens if you have a giant graph and you want to be able to look at things? Well, DBT provides tools for you to search through and figure out and use these lineage filters like I used, and I'll use them later, but being able to actually explore the lineage through these filters. So let's do this. Let's go ahead and let's generate the documentations. So it's DBT docs generate. We'll generate my documentation. So what this is doing is it's compiling all the dependencies and it's putting all this together into this JSON blob. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to serve it locally just so that I can see it. All right, so here's the documentation generated by DBT. I'm just going to go to the data dictionaries for now. So I'm going to go to the database and modeled DBO ontime denorm. You can see here's the information about my table for ontime denorm. I got the columns. You can see here. I got descriptions. It's listing which tests were run against it. Okay, so this allows somebody. Let's say I want to look for I'm looking for the year. I can do a search using their documentation and find the tables and the views and the artifacts that use year in their columns or a reference in their documentation somewhere. So now I have a searchable data dictionary. But it's better than that, so we'll keep going. You can also see what references ontime denorm. And in this case, the only thing that references ontime denorm that I've built so far are the tests. So these are all the tests that reference ontime denorm. But what it means is if we were to change something with ontime denorm, so let's just go to another one. Let's go to carrier data. Let's say we wanted to change something in carrier data, and I wanted to find out who references carrier data. I know that this view does, and so I can go and fix that. Know that I have to make sure that I don't break this view. Back to ontime denorm. Okay, we can also see what ontime denorm depends on. It depends on ontime data. It depends on airport data and the carrier data view. So now I can actually see who is upstream from this table. Here's the configuration source that I defined in DBT. And when DBT compiled it, then I have the SQL for it. This is great, but this is kind of painful to walk through and figure out all this lineage. So let's look at the lineage. Here's the lineage graph. I'm going to explode this up. There, now you have the actual true lineage graph here. And so what I want to be able to do is say, okay, let's say carrier codes changed. Who needs to change and who needs to be rerun? I'm going to show you how to rerun a model based on its lineage. But in this case, I'm going to choose carrier codes plus. And this is the plus is the dialect for everything after. Plus before the word is everything before carrier codes. And so in fact, I could put carrier data. So you can see everything that's affected if I change carrier data. Here's everything before carrier data and everything after carrier data. If I wanted to see everything downstream from airport codes so that I could change it, just airport codes plus. Now I know if I want to run select the model airport codes plus, it's going to run these three models. All right, so that's the lineage. I'm going to take a quick pause before I get into some of the other advanced things. All right, so looking at the questions, I've got a clarification. Creating a table with the column defined as not null. Oh, by default. Defining it as not null. I think you know what, I haven't explored having to do that. That's a good question. I'd have to take that one offline. I'm sure that's a problem that's been solved as part of the model creation process. And in fact, one of the things that I would do there is if I have tight constraints that DBT can't handle is I create the table first as a part of my, so what you can do is you create the table. What I could do is create the table and then define that pre-created table in the sources. And sources are just things like DBT is not creating the table. So like this raw on-time data table, it already existed. I'm just telling DBT, hey, this thing exists so that you can reference it because I reference this on-time data. So what I would do is I would have a process in Airflow or something that makes sure that those are created with the not nulls. But I'd be surprised if DBT doesn't allow you to do that. But if it doesn't, you have another path here. It's not going to be a roadblock. Another question, are those tests on the source and when fail, all downstream processing stops? Yeah, so this is what is going to do is the tests are defined. So let's go to one of these tests. And let's go in here. Okay. It's the test on the target. So in this case, I'm saying after I run my ELT, after the transformation runs, run these tests. So what I would do is if I have a test like accepted values are not null, like I don't want null values to go into my on-time denorm, what I actually would do is I would put those null, not null tests on the source data. I would say, hey, here's carrier data. And with carrier data, as you can see here, I would actually run the tests on the sources first and make sure all the sources are correct. So I could actually run the tests on just the lookup data to make sure that they all pass. So in fact, I could probably do that in relatively short order. So if I do model tag lookups, I think it's lookups. Where's it lookup? Take a look, lookup. So this is going to run all the tests on the source. So what I would actually do as a part of my process, and I'm kind of shortcutting it, I'm not running it as a part of my process, but I'm saying, hey, make sure that all the data quality rules about my source data pass first before you even start the pipeline. So in Airflow, for example, I would say DBT test on my lookup data, on the source data. And then if those pass, then if those fail, then Airflow stops, it doesn't run another job. If it passes, then Airflow can run the next node in the DAG or in the process. And so what it's doing is it's actually running the quality rules on the target. Are DBT tests tend to be used for testing your data or testing your pipelines or both? It's intended for testing your data, but one thing that I did in my TDDE talk on test-driven data engineering is you can use them to test your pipelines. And so what I would do is using tags and labels. And in fact, I wonder if I have an example of this. I might have one where I put all of this together. It's not in this one. But what I would do is I would actually write all of my data quality tests first, make sure that they work, and I'd split them as functionality versus data quality. So things that must be true about the data when it's done running, and things that must be true based on test cases related to the actual transformations that I'm doing. So you can do both. Can DBT connect to a password vault that controls enterprise secrets? I have not had to do that, so I don't know the answer to that. I believe DBT Cloud has that functionality built in. Now, again, what I would probably do, because I'm gonna be running my DBT most of the time through some sort of command line, but I'm gonna coordinate that with an orchestration tool. And that orchestration tool that I'm probably going to use is likely going to be Airflow, but something. I mean, I have an orchestration tool built right here in Bash that I could do the same thing. And that's where, and then I would populate my environment variables that way. That's one way to do it. But I don't think DBT CLI has that functionality. DBT CLI that I've got here is mainly for running the ELT. But DBT itself is just Python libraries. And so you can, it's very easy to extend. You can see I extended tests, but you can extend a lot of functionality within DBT. And these are some of the things. I would probably go into their Slack community, which I go in there, and when I'm looking for answers to stuff like that, that's where I go. I go to the Slack community. Great question though. Yeah, I mean, managing your passwords is very critical. And that's a little bit why in my profiles, I tend to use environment variables instead of anything else. See another question, a large warehouse implementation, does DBT project contain all pipelines, or are they broken up to minimize regression impacts? So this is where things can get a little bit difficult, because you want to make sure that you can do all the references. If you're getting to a large one, I haven't had to do one that was so large that I couldn't have this giant monolith, so I can't answer that completely. But on smaller scales, there's two things that you can do. You can use the sources to reference the external ones, or reference the external lineage, or you build them into a bigger one. But typically, what I've seen is they're all in one project. But I don't know the answer. I don't think it's impossible to do it. Just haven't gotten there. These are good questions. Oh, nice. Someone's got their DBT instance grabbing secrets from GC type of vault. Very good. All right, so that's the lineage. And let's see, I showed you how to run the test based on lineage, but I'm going to show you how easy it is to just add a model. And I like these, by the way, I do like all the questions. I think it's really important. Like, those are the things that once you get past this step in your DBT journey, you've got to start answering all of those questions too. And we're just scratching the surface. I mean, we haven't scratched incremental models. We haven't scratched anything beyond SQL Server. So dealing with the nuances of Snowflake. So like, I've done this on Snowflake where some of the default adapter functions don't work. So I've had to override them, but it's very easy to do that. But in this case, I'm not going to get to those. Let's just show you how easy it is to add a new model. And I'm going to do it poorly. I'm going to add a view. I'm not going to define the columns. I'm just going to say, here's a view, here's a description. That's just metadata. I already have a file created, and I'm just going to add the SQL extension on it. And all I'm doing is I'm adding it to the model database. It's part of the daily tags, and it's part of views. So anything that's a view, that if I want to recreate it, I'm going to have a view label. And all I'm doing is it's the January view. So I'm selecting from ontime denorm. Again, I'm referencing an existing model where month equals 1. And all I'm going to do here is I'm saying, okay, this is referencing ontime denorm. So I'm going to rerun this model. And so I'm actually going to rerun this based on, I'm not going to run it based on this lineage. I'm going to run it based off of, no, I will run it off of this lineage. So let's say the airport data was recreated. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to here. I'm going to rerun this. Let's go back to run. I'm going to do airport dash model airport data plus. So everything after airport data, I'm going to rerun. And if you recall, all I did was I added that model SQL file. So I'm actually rebuilding my airport data and saying, hey, I rebuilt the airport data, so I better rebuild the ontime denorm table. But if you notice, I just added that one config file with that model definition for the view, and it picked that up automatically. I didn't have to change anything. So that's all there was to adding the new one. So if I actually go ahead, I'm going to regenerate the docs. Reserve those. If I go to my database and modeled, you'll see I have the view here. If I go to the lineage, you can see that the view is on here now. And so that's what was created when I did airport data plus. This is what was run. So again, this is really powerful for you as an operational team, for your end users to be able to find what things are affected, for your data analysts to explore your data. I find this to be super powerful. And maybe not everybody might understand why this is important, but when you don't have this type of information, this should probably resonate at this point, because you're going, yep, that's something I could have used a long time ago. All right. So I can do the same thing with the tag lineage. So I could rerun this based on a tags lineage, but I'm going to skip that. It's the same thing though. I could say, hey, run all models where the tag is lookup, but anything that depends on that downstream. And that's what this would be doing. It would rerun everything after the fact. That's after any of the lookups. So that's kind of the base of the core functionality to look at it and say, okay, what is DBT giving me to start with? There's so much more that DBT allows you to do. We're just scratching the surface. So I'm just going to quick overview a couple of those things. Macros. So macros are something that, for example, there's one, I think it was like get batch size. So they're built into the adapters, they're built into the functionality, but these are ways for you to create additional functional functions and reusable computations. So this is similar to like a SQL function. I've used macros, so a test itself. If you look at in here, I don't have any macros run in this one, but I've had some where in the Snowflake adapter, one of the macros didn't work. And so what I did was I rewrote the macro for what it was supposed to be so that I can get my pipelines to work. So I can extend DBT very easily. But you can see here in my tests, this is no different. A macro is just it's gonna have, this is called macro instead of test, and it's gonna say end macro down here. But these are gonna be functions that I can use and reuse. And so that's how you customize DBT for your own needs. Some other features that are super important. Again, I mentioned incremental models, so I don't want to kill and fill my models every time, especially in a large data warehouse. That takes forever. I've had plenty of clients where those might take days, and so we don't want to be doing that. The other one that's important is the pre and post hooks. So somebody asked about passwords and things. So if you don't want to do that in Airflow, use your pre and post hooks. So this is where before you run a model, you run the pre-hook. Maybe that's getting passwords, maybe that's doing some configuration, maybe that's giving access to your user ID. And like one of the examples that's often used is in Snowflake, I want to grant access to be able to write to specific tables or models. And then you have post hooks, unwinding things or removing things that are done after the fact. Let's say you create a bunch of temp tables or you add access to someone, remove those temp tables and remove the access, that temporary access. Custom data tests. So I showed you a generic data test that I overrode, but you can create your own data test. So one of the ones that I was working on was a threshold. There's a threshold, like writing a threshold test or being able to compare two tables, which those already exist, but doing them for my own use. Doing snapshotting. So creating your type 2 tables. Snapshots are something that you can use. So often, you don't always just want point in time data warehouses. You want to be able to say, okay, how did this row change over time? And so DBT's built in that functionality within the framework. But then another one is linking downstream consumers, which are called exposures. And so let's say I have a Tableau dashboard, and that Tableau dashboard, if somebody says, hey, what's this field in this Tableau dashboard? Where is it sourced from? How do you find that? Well, you can actually document the metadata about your Tableau dashboards or whatever your downstream consumers are. Maybe it's data in another system, data in another model, whatever that might be, or another project. But what'll happen is that lineage graph that I showed you before is DBT won't create those artifacts in the actual databases and in Tableau because that's not what it's for. What it'll do though is it'll link them. So if somebody says, hey, this Tableau dashboard references all these tables, now you can go find out where to look for data behind a Tableau dashboard. So that's pretty useful. The other thing that's really useful is analyses. Analyses are really nice because now you can actually you can use the Jinja templates, write the code and do references within DBT, compile that SQL using DBT, and then that'll create the actual SQL that maybe you need to put it in a custom SQL in Power BI or in an Excel sheet or in a Spark job, whatever that might be. But you can actually use the same project, those same data reference things like ref ontime denorm. I can use that same reference syntax. It won't build the artifacts, but what it'll do is it'll compile the SQL so that you can use that SQL somewhere else. But what that allows you to do is now you have Lineage for that. And then there's more functionality around package management. How do I make sure that everything's installed? And one of the things I really want to explore is a tighter integration with doing this instead of doing it via command line. But what about Python or something like that? And I have one more slide, and then I'm gonna answer the rest of these questions that are up. This last one is taking a look at the references. So if you're using DBT or you're going to use it, highly recommend getting DBT utils and DBT expectations. So this is going to give you good utilities and testing and testing functionality. Sign up and go to the DBT discourse community. A lot of good information on best practices there. And of course, sign up for DBT Slack. Be active in there, ask questions in there. I keep up on it all the time and try to find out what's new and what's happening. Okay, so let's field the rest of the questions. We got a few minutes left. So it seems like a macro might be a likely place for a query to go wrong. Absolutely. Anytime you're writing code, that's where things are going to go bad. I imagine profiling slow queries could be difficult across multiple data sources. Does DBT have any capabilities for diagnosing bad queries outside of showing your compiled SQL? Well, by performance, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, if you let's just demonstrate. I'm just going to show you something. So what DBT does when you run any of these functionalities, and this might not answer your question, but if you have something that's syntactically incorrect, when you run a DBT test or DBT run or DBT debug, it's going to actually compile these things and check them out. So if I wrote something in here, I had one where when I was writing this, I accidentally treated this as a parameter. And then if I try to run anything, it's going to fail when I try to run because it's going to compile. Whoops, sorry. I wanted the test on that one. Oh, now I've done it. When it's going to look at the tests, here's the test. What you'll find is it'll try to start running the test and then you'll get an error. And so in this case, I got an error in the test, and so I know that the test has a failure. I don't have it set up to do anything more detailed than that, though. I didn't really have time to set that up. But when I am troubleshooting the queries, I know that you said besides showing your compiled SQL, but that's a pretty good way to go and grab and find out what's going on. I mean, what would you do? What would you do differently in a lot of pipelines that I see? Like, that's basically what we do. We go, well, what's the SQL that it's running? Let's go profile that SQL separately, because that SQL is still going to run. If I'm in here, I don't know if this is still going to let me go in there. Probably won't. So if I actually went into here and I selected, if I ran this compiled query, I can profile this outside. That'd be a great question though, if somebody's put that in there, but I don't know. You'd have to get the compiled SQL and get the compiled SQL. So what that does is when you run it, it'll create a compiled folder. That's where all your queries will be. And so if you wanted to try them, you'd probably have to grab them from there, but haven't had to do that before. Good question. I think that's all the questions so far. Let's see here. Yeah, so we're just about done. So if there's any other questions, we got about a minute and a half left. Happy to answer them. It's a lot of material here. And this is just getting you started. I mean, this is just for you to create your first project. And as you saw, lots of people have lots of really good questions. But what DBT has done is they've taken a lot of those data warehousing problems that come up over and over and over, and they've made them easier to solve instead of having to reinvent the wheel every time you build them. And there's a lot of people that have extensive extension libraries that you can install as a part of your install. One thing I'll also mention, if you're doing your development locally, notice down here, I'm going to hit clear on this. Notice here, I'm using a Python virtual environment. When you're doing your development in DBT, make sure this is something that you want to do is you want to use virtual environments and not install the libraries natively on your system. I highly recommend using Python virtual environments for things like this, and that's what I use. So now I have a DBT 1.0 virtual environment. I actually have a DBT 0.2 virtual environment, and that allows me to do different development on different versions. Okay. don't think there's any other questions, and we're at time. So thanks everybody for joining. Appreciate you coming today, and you know, I'll do as I do deeper dives into other functionality. Keep your eyes peeled for those. So thank you.